Honorable Senators, my name is Christopher Alkenbrack, and I'm 45 years old. My life was turned upside down on April 29, 1992, when at the age of 24, I received a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. At that time, there were no drug therapies for MS. When the drug therapies became available, I subscribed to this line of treatment for many years, and then in 2009 started a course of chemotherapy to keep my MS at bay. I lived for the first few years with minor symptoms of my disease, which were more annoyances than anything else. Shortly after my diagnosis, I became a teacher, and for the last 6 years of my short-lived career, a school vice principal and then principal. I was retired by my neurologist at the age of 36 when I was told my MS had now transitioned to the secondary progressive course. At this stage of the game, there's no turning back. In some ways, I'm just like your everyday average Canadian, and in others, I am profoundly different. Over the years, I've read much about multiple sclerosis so that I could live a better life and understand my disease. That is simply what anyone with a chronic illness should do. I volunteered and fundraised for the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada and was even chapter president for a local section for 1 year. That is simply what anyone with a chronic illness should do. I lived my life to the best of my ability with my apparent limitations. That is simply what anyone with a chronic illness should do. My wife and I had 2 children who have never had the privilege of growing up in a normal home because they were acutely aware of their father's obvious limitations. Despite all of the knowledge, personal research, volunteerism, education, I, like tens of thousands of Canadians with multiple sclerosis, no longer controlled my life. I was at the mercy of this insidious disease. I was at the mercy of current research into various drug therapies. In November 2009, an important link resurfaced. A century-old idea suggesting that MS may have a vascular connection. This made sense to me, as this notion had been questioned for many decades before the research into the autoimmune theory started. Did you know that all MS lesions are periventricular, meaning that they surround the veins in the brain? Well, neither did I until I read about it in the scientific literature. Did you know that in the 1930s MS patients were given blood thinners because it was believed by neurologists at the time that multiple sclerosis was a vascular disorder? Neither did I until I read about it in the scientific literature. Since that day in 2009, when we learned that a new innovative treatment may relieve some of the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, I was elated. I never believed it could be that simple. But really it is, or at least it was for me. My family physician provided me with a referral to go to a private clinic where I was tested for and diagnosed in Canada with a venous abnormality. At that time, I naively thought that I would be able to see a Canadian doctor for this, but I was wrong. I naively thought that I would receive treatment and compassion in a country that I have loved for my entire life. I naively thought that I would be followed by Canadian doctors who would keep their commitment to maintaining the health of tax-paying Canadians. But I was wrong. I naively thought that the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada would support Canadians with multiple sclerosis. But I was wrong. Roadblock after roadblock led me to withdraw a large portion of my retirement savings to leave the country that I love and become a medical refugee seeking treatment outside the borders of my country at great personal expense. Since being diagnosed with chronic cerebrospinal venous insufficiency, I now look at the Canadian healthcare system as one that discriminates against some of society's most vulnerable patients. I've been forced into a position where I follow the medical literature more than I care to. As I listen to the ongoing debate through various forms of media and read the medical journals, I can only think where we would be in Canada if such resistance and debate came from the medical community every time a treatment was made available to help alleviate some of the symptoms of a chronic, debilitating, lifelong disease. I have to wonder if an entire generation of multiple sclerosis patients will worsen, given the obvious failure in long-term studies now available, calling into question the efficacy of the current drug therapies for multiple sclerosis. I have to wonder if such resistance would be made if a new miracle drug treatment became available that could offer the same type of relief to MS patients. I have to wonder what it would be like to live in a country where I could access care for a vascular condition that was diagnosed in Canada. The debate on CCSVI is polarized. It is an emotional one. For every story you hear of complications, you will hear a dozen testimonials to the fact that the treatment works. Yes, it really does. I would encourage you to consider an important fact that was raised by the neurologist Dr. Robert Zvatnov at the second annual conference for the International Society of Neurovascular Disease in Orlando, Florida in February of 2012. In his presentation, which I attended through an online webinar from my home in Nova Scotia, he raised two very important points. These points give an important framework to all past and future studies. First, he brought to light that most of the negative studies on CCSVI are published in neurological journals, and most of the positive studies on CCSVI are published in vascular journals. This has not changed since that time. Second, he pointed out that the best way to diagnose CCSVI is through a multimodal approach. That means that a combination of methods must be used to provide a definitive diagnosis of CCSVI. In light of this, it is not surprising that there are many negative CCSVI studies, and that most of these studies were performed by neurologists and published in neurological medical journals. As a Canadian living with multiple sclerosis, I personally did not have the time to wait for the debate to be resolved. My health is worth more to me than waiting for the conclusion to a turf war that grows uglier and more polarized each day. Does treatment for CCSVI work for everyone? No. Did it work for me? Yes. Just ask my daughter, my son, or my wife about the improvements in quality of life. Is it a placebo effect? No. Just ask my doctor, who gasped when she saw some of my symptoms of MS improve after treatment. Just ask hematologist Dr. Daniel Robitaille of Montreal's renowned Heart Institute, who has stated in radio and television interviews that it is not. Dr. Robitaille is one of the only Canadian doctors who provides follow-up on MS patients who have been treated for CCSVI. Surprisingly, she is not a neurologist. Maybe, just maybe, we could have avoided the tragedies and deaths of Canadians like Mahir Mostik from St. Catharines, Ontario, if he had been provided proper follow-up care in Canada and not turned away from a Canadian hospital. Maybe stories like that of Francine Dehaye of Montreal, when she was told, "Go back to Poland" to have her stent unblocked, would not exist if Canadians with MS were not discriminated against. Please do not humor me by stating that MS patients in Canada receive proper follow-up treatment after they have been abroad for CCSVI procedure, because I can cite dozens of examples of people who did not. Senator Cordy has presented a bill to ensure that Canadians who have sought treatment for CCSVI outside the borders of our nation will receive proper follow-up care from the proper specialists. CCSVI is not a neurological condition, and therefore it does not require follow-up care with neurologists. One has to question why the medical files of MS patients across the nation are filled with refusals to consult vascular specialists for a vascular problem. Multiple sclerosis is a neurological condition, and it does require regular visits to neurologists. It requires monitoring to chart the downward decline in health from year to year. Why a Canadian with multiple sclerosis is refused follow-up care in Canada because his or her neurologist does not adhere to a vascular connection which has long been established in the medical literature simply baffles me. Honorable Senators As a proud Canadian father, taxpayer, and MS patient, I trust that you will vote favorably for Bill S-204 so that MS patients can count on the proper follow-up care with the proper specialists. I trust that you will vote favorably for Bill S-204 so that Canada remains at the forefront of research into neurovascular and neurodegenerative conditions. This decision is not one to be taken lightly. You may have to go against your party line. You may have to take a stand for Canadians and their health, despite some of the experts that you have already heard or will hear. You may have to come to a realization that Canadians with multiple sclerosis have had to fight for basic health care in Canada, and that this is simply wrong. Canada should not be playing politics with the lives of Canadians living with MS. Please do the right thing and give your support to Bill S-204. Christopher Alkenbrack, Wolfville, Nova Scotia, Canada.